She was on her knees in the rubble before anyone else had even moved. The dust was still hanging in the air, thick and white, turning everything on that construction site into something unrecognizable. And she had already crossed 40 feet of chaos to reach a man she barely knew. She did not hesitate. She did not wait for someone to tell her what to do. She dropped beside him, her hands moving with the kind of steadiness that does not come from training but from character. The kind that only reveals itself when everything around you is falling apart. Nobody sent her. Nobody asked her. She simply saw a man going down, and she went to him. And in that moment, kneeling in the dust beside a man she knew only as a laborer on her job site, she had absolutely no idea, not a single thought in the world, that the man whose hand she was reaching for was the man she had promised to marry. She had no idea he had been watching her for 30 days. She had no idea that the very man she was fighting to keep conscious, calling to him, telling him to stay with her, refusing to let him close his eyes, had spent an entire month in disguise, observing her from a distance, testing her, measuring her, asking the ugliest question a man can ask about the woman he loves. She did not know any of that. All she knew was that a man was hurt and she was the closest person to him, and that was more than enough reason to stay right where she was. What she did in that moment, and in the hours that followed, answered every question he had been afraid to ask out loud. It answered them more completely, more honestly, and more devastatingly than 30 days of watching ever could have. Because what she revealed in that rubble was something you cannot manufacture for an audience. She showed him exactly who she was when she believed no one who mattered was watching. His name was Marcus Ellison. He was 43 years old, and on paper, he was the kind of man whose life looked like it had been built according to a blueprint most men only ever dream about. He had grown up with nothing, raised by his mother in a 2-bedroom apartment in East Charlotte, North Carolina, after his father walked out when Marcus was 8 years old and never looked back. And he had turned that nothing into something so substantial that even people who had never met him knew exactly what his last name meant in certain rooms. He managed over $240 million in assets. He employed more than 300 people, and 3 weeks before a beam shifted on a Charlotte construction site and brought his entire experiment crashing down around him, he had made a decision that was either the bravest or the most foolish thing he had ever done. He was not sure which, he is still not entirely sure which, but it changed everything. The woman at the center of all of it was named Vanessa Caldwell. She was a senior architect, 38 years old, the kind of professional who designed buildings that made strangers stop on sidewalks and look up. She had met Marcus at a charity fundraiser on a warm Thursday evening, and they had made each other laugh before they had exchanged a single name. That had mattered. It had mattered from the very first night. That laughter came before credentials, that they had found each other human before they found each other impressive. But Marcus had a wound that went all the way back to a 9-year-old boy standing in a kitchen, watching his father's car pull out of the driveway for the last time. A wound his mother's quiet words had reopened just enough, 2 months before all of this began. And a man with that kind of wound, no matter how successful, no matter how rational, can talk himself into believing almost anything if he is afraid enough of being wrong. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand why Marcus Ellison did what he did, you have to understand where Marcus Ellison came from. Not the press releases, not the business journal profiles, the actual beginning. The apartment on Eastway Drive in Charlotte, with the window unit that rattled all summer, and the rent his mother paid by working double shifts at the hospital, where she was a licensed practical nurse for 22 years. Denise Ellison was not a woman who asked for help and was not a woman who complained. But she was also not a woman who pretended things were easier than they were. She told her son the truth about money from the time he was old enough to understand it. She told him they did not have much of it, that this was not a catastrophe, that plenty of people had built meaningful lives from much less, but that if he wanted a different kind of life, he was going to have to go get it himself, because nobody in their position was going to hand it to him. Marcus had listened to every word. He had been listening to his mother his entire life. He graduated from his high school in the top 5% of his class. He earned a partial academic scholarship to the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, worked 20 hours a week in the university's facilities department to cover the rest, and graduated 4 years later with a finance degree and a clarity of purpose that his professors still remember when they talk about him today. He did not go to work for anyone else after that. He did not have the temperament for it. He had grown up watching his mother give the best hours of her day to an institution that had no particular loyalty to her in return. And he had made a quiet decision somewhere in his teenage years that he would rather risk failure on his own terms than guarantee a limited ceiling working for someone else's dream. That decision was either visionary or reckless, depending on who you ask. What it produced, after 11 years of work that included 3 near bankruptcies and one period where Marcus ate rice and canned beans for 6 weeks straight, was Ellison Capital Management. By the time he was 43, Marcus Ellison had the kind of life that looks effortless from the outside and is exhausting from the inside. He had the penthouse, he had the car, he had the firm, he had the name. What he had learned along the way, and what he had not fully reckoned with until his mother sat across from him at her kitchen table and said what she said, was that success of a certain scale changes the nature of every relationship you have. Not because the people around you necessarily change, but because you can never be entirely sure whether they are responding to you or to what you represent. Marcus had seen it happen to other men he knew. He had watched friendships dissolve into transactional dynamics he could not have predicted. He had watched business partners who seemed principled reveal themselves to be opportunistic. He had learned to be careful. He had maybe learned to be too careful. And by the time the question about Vanessa took root, careful had become something closer to suspicious. The conversation happened on a Sunday morning in early August. Marcus had driven over to his mother's house in the neighborhood where she had lived for the past 12 years. The house he had bought her when the firm first turned a significant profit. The house she had initially refused to accept because Denise Ellison had a lifelong resistance to anything that felt like charity, even from her own son. And it had taken Marcus 3 separate conversations and a very long letter to convince her that it was not charity. It was gratitude made concrete. She had eventually agreed. She kept the house immaculately and grew tomatoes in the backyard, and had her girlfriends over every other Friday evening for cards. And she was content there in a way that made Marcus genuinely happy every time he visited. He was visiting that Sunday because he wanted to talk to her about Vanessa, about the ring he was considering, about how certain he was, or how certain he was trying to be. He did not expect what she said. He expected her to be happy. He expected enthusiasm, and maybe a few tears. Because Denise Ellison was not a demonstrative woman, but she was a deeply loving one. And she had watched Marcus go through enough of the wrong relationships over the years that she genuinely wanted him to find the right one. She had said, more than once, that Vanessa seemed good for him. Steady, real, not performing. So when the conversation shifted and her voice got careful, that particular careful, that Marcus had been reading since childhood, the one that meant she was about to say something she knew might land hard. Ooh. He had felt it before she opened her mouth. She told him she liked Vanessa. She said it first, and she meant it. And then she asked him, quietly, the way his mother always asked the questions that mattered, whether he was sure. Not whether Vanessa was good, whether he was sure, whether he had tested the depth of what was between them, or whether he was simply being carried by how good it felt when everything was comfortable and secure and running smoothly. She did not accuse Vanessa of anything. That is important to say clearly. Denise Ellison was not the kind of woman who made accusations she could not support, and she had no evidence against Vanessa Caldwell. Because there was no evidence against Vanessa Caldwell. What Denise had was history. She had 30 years of watching men who had money get involved with women and never be entirely sure whether the woman would have chosen them if the money had not been part of the picture. She had watched it damage good men. She had watched it end good relationships that might have survived anything else. And she had watched her own son build something remarkable from nothing, and knew better than anyone what it would cost him emotionally if he made the biggest commitment of his life and got it wrong. She had not said any of this to plant suspicion. She had said it because she loved her son, and she was asking him to be honest with himself. Unfortunately, a seed dropped in fertile soil grows whether or not the gardener intended to plant it. The 2 months that followed were a slow, private unraveling of the confidence Marcus had felt about Vanessa. It did not happen all at once. It was not a single conversation or a single moment that broke his certainty. It was accumulative, the way certain kinds of damage always are. He would notice Vanessa's ease in expensive places and wonder whether she was at ease or whether she was comfortable, and whether there was a difference, and whether the difference mattered. He would remember the early months of their relationship and try to excavate them for signs he might have missed, and find none, and feel somehow more unsettled by the absence of evidence than he would have been by the presence of it. He was an intelligent man. He knew, on some rational level, that he was doing something irrational. But intelligence and emotional wounds do not always communicate with each other effectively, especially when the wound goes back 35 years to a boy standing in a kitchen watching a card disappear. He called Calvin Brooks on a Wednesday afternoon in late September. Calvin had been his friend since their freshman year of college. One of those friendships forged in the specific pressure of two young men from similar backgrounds trying to navigate a world that had not been built with them in mind. And it had survived the decades in the way that only truly honest friendships do. Calvin ran a contracting company that handled mid-scale commercial construction projects across the Charlotte metro area. He was not surprised to hear from Marcus. They talked regularly. He was deeply surprised by what Marcus asked him for. He was even more surprised when Marcus explained why. There was a long silence on the phone after Marcus finished laying out the plan, the kind of silence that means a friend is deciding how honest to be. And then Calvin said the thing he always said when Marcus was about to do something that Calvin thought was either brilliant or destructive. He said it could go beautiful or it could go ugly. He said there was no in-between with a thing like this. Marcus told him he understood. And Calvin, because he was a real friend, gave him what he asked for. Vanessa Caldwell had been building things since she was 7 years old. Not buildings at first, she was too young for that. But she had her grandmother's kitchen table covered in cardboard and tape and glue every weekend that she can remember from her childhood, constructing miniature versions of the world around her. The church down the street, the library where her mother took her on Saturday mornings, the community center where she took her first drawing class. Her grandmother, Ruth Caldwell, had been a woman of extraordinary patience and extraordinary practicality. A retired schoolteacher from Birmingham, Alabama, who had moved to North Carolina in the late 1970s and settled into a life of quiet, deliberate dignity. Ruth had watched her granddaughter build things every weekend and said, with a certainty that Vanessa still carries with her today, that the child had an eye for structure, that she could see how things fit together, that this was a gift worth taking seriously. Vanessa had taken it seriously every day since. She earned her architecture degree from North Carolina State University, spent 4 years working entry-level positions at 2 different firms in Raleigh, and then made the move to Charlotte at 32, joining the design division of Mitchell Hartley Associates, one of the most established architectural firms in the Carolinas. She was good at her work, in the specific way that separates professionals who are technically competent from professionals who are genuinely exceptional. She had technical mastery and she had vision, but what set her apart from most of her colleagues was something harder to quantify. She had what her senior partners described as moral architecture. She did not design buildings that looked impressive on a rendering and fell short in person. She designed buildings that served the people who would actually use them. She thought about the janitor's access route and the elderly visitor's sight lines, and the acoustics in the room where the community meeting would be held. She thought about who the building was actually for, not just who was paying for it. By the time she met Marcus at the fundraiser 18 months before the accident, Vanessa had a reputation in her field that she had built entirely on the quality of her work and the consistency of her character. She was known as someone who pushed back when clients asked for shortcuts that would compromise structural safety or accessibility. She was known as someone who credited her team publicly and defended them in rooms where they were not present to defend themselves. She was known as someone who took her lunch in the break room with the junior associates rather than at expensive restaurants with the senior partners, not because she was performing egalitarianism, but because she genuinely preferred the conversations. All of this was simply who she was. It was not a presentation, it was not a brand. It was just Vanessa Caldwell on an ordinary day, when no one was evaluating her, being the same person she had always been since Ruth Caldwell sat across a kitchen table and told her that a gift worth having was a gift worth honoring. What Vanessa did not know, what she had no way of knowing during the weeks of Marcus's disguise, was that her professional world was under a kind of attack she had not yet identified. Her name was Priscilla Morton. She was 29 years old, a junior associate who had joined Mitchell Hartley Associates 2 years earlier, and Vanessa had been her primary mentor from the beginning. Vanessa had invested genuine time in Priscilla, reviewing her drawings, giving her honest feedback, advocating for her to be included in client presentations, defending her work to senior partners when the partners were being dismissive in the way that senior partners sometimes are about junior associates they have not yet taken seriously. Vanessa had done all of this because it was the right thing to do, and because Ruth Caldwell had told her, more than once, that every woman who gets somewhere has a responsibility to hold the door open for the ones coming behind her. Priscilla Morton had been watching Vanessa work for 2 years. She had been watching, specifically, the way Vanessa developed ideas, the long evenings at her desk, the sketchbooks filled with preliminary drawings, the methodical way she moved from concept to structural calculation to final presentation. Priscilla had been watching all of it, and at some point in the preceding months, watching had turned into something else. It had turned into studying, and studying had turned into something that Vanessa had not thought to protect herself against. because she had not imagined that someone she was actively trying to help would see her work as a resource rather than a model. The specific project at issue was the Lindenmeyer Waterfront Cultural Center, a major commission that Vanessa had been developing for 4 months, working nights and weekends, pouring into the design not just her professional skill, but something much more personal. The waterfront had a history, and Vanessa's family had a connection to that history that made the project feel less like an assignment and more like an obligation. Vanessa's grandmother Ruth had grown up near a waterfront, not unlike the one the cultural center would overlook. She had grown up in a time when the water and the work around it were divided along lines that nobody talked about openly, but everybody understood. She had told Vanessa stories about that waterfront, about the people who worked it, about the dignity they carried in spite of everything, about the women who sat on the banks on Sunday afternoons and watched the boats, and talked about what the world might someday look like. Vanessa had built those stories into the design. Every choice she made in the Lindenmeyer concept, the sight lines, the gathering spaces, the materials, the way light would move through the building at different hours, carried the fingerprints of those stories. It was the most personal work she had ever done in her professional life. And Priscilla Morton had been paying close attention to every sketch, every revision, every file on the shared drive that Vanessa had not thought to password protect, because it had not occurred to her that she needed to. While Marcus Ellison was renting a 1-bedroom apartment under the name Marcus Reed and showing up to Calvin Brooks's job sites in work boots that were too new, Vanessa Caldwell was carrying 2 weights she had not yet fully registered. She was carrying the quiet unease of a woman whose fiancé had gone unusually silent during a business trip. Not entirely unreachable, but distant in a way that felt slightly off, slightly wrong, in a way she could not articulate but could not dismiss. And she was carrying the early unidentified signs of a professional situation that was moving toward a reckoning she was not yet aware of. She had not yet opened the email from Priscilla. She had not yet seen the evidence of what was happening to her work while she was focused on her clients and her drawings, and the quiet discomfort of a relationship that felt, for the first time, slightly out of alignment. She did not know what was coming. She was simply doing what Vanessa Caldwell had always done. She was showing up. She was doing her work. She was being, without audience or reward, exactly who she had always been. Marcus Ellison reported for his first day of work as Marcus Reed on a Monday morning in early October. Calvin Brooks had placed him with a crew working a commercial renovation in Midtown Charlotte, an older building being converted into office space, the kind of project that requires experienced tradespeople and produces an enormous amount of physical labor. Marcus had told Calvin he wanted whatever was dirtiest and most demanding. Calvin had taken him at his word. The crew foreman, a 54-year-old man named Gerald who had been working construction for 30 years and had a face like he had spent most of those years looking directly into the sun, took one look at Marcus's hands on the first morning and made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He said nothing else. He simply pointed Marcus toward a pile of old plasterboard that needed to come down, handed him a pry bar, and walked away. Marcus spent the first 3 hours of his first day learning that a pry bar is substantially heavier than it looks, and that plasterboard dust gets into everything, including places you did not know you had. By the end of the first week, Marcus had developed blisters on both hands, a persistent ache in his lower back that he had not felt since he stopped playing recreational basketball in his mid-30s, and a layer of limestone dust that he was genuinely beginning to believe had become a permanent feature of his skin. He had also learned something he had not anticipated learning. He had learned what it felt like to be invisible. This is not a metaphor. It is something that happens to men who work with their hands in a city that has decided, on some level it does not examine very often, that the men who build things are part of the infrastructure, rather than part of the community. Marcus had spent his adult life being recognized, not always in ways he wanted, but recognized. People knew his name. People knew his firm. People altered their behavior when he walked into a room. In a hard hat and work boots on a construction site, not a single person altered anything. He was simply there. One more body doing the work that needed to be done. The invisibility was disorienting. And then, slowly, it became instructive. He started to pay attention to the other men on the crew, in a way that he realized, with some discomfort, he had not been paying attention to people like this for a long time. There was a 22-year-old named Devin who had been working construction for 3 years to help his mother keep her house, and who talked about his younger siblings the way Marcus had heard men talk about their own children, with a mixture of fierce pride and quiet worry that was unmistakably parental, even though Devin was barely an adult himself. There was a 61-year-old named Raymond who moved more slowly than the younger men, but worked with a precision that made the foreman visibly relax whenever Raymond was assigned to something that mattered. Raymond had been doing this work for 40 years and had opinions about load-bearing walls and structural integrity that, as far as Marcus could tell, were frequently more sophisticated than the opinions of the engineers, who occasionally visited the site in clean clothes and left without getting dust on anything. Marcus watched these men. He listened to them, and something in him that had been braced and defensive for a very long time began, imperceptibly, to loosen. He had been working the crew for 11 days when Calvin Brooks called him on a Tuesday evening to tell him that Marcus's crew was being reassigned. A new project had come in, a brownstone renovation in the Dilworth neighborhood, an older residential building being converted into professional office space. The project architect would be on site regularly, Calvin said, to oversee structural decisions. He mentioned the firm. He mentioned the project name. He did not mention the architect's name. Marcus showed up on his first day at the new site on a Wednesday morning, adjusted his hard hat, and spent the first 20 minutes unloading equipment with Devon, who had been moved to the same crew, before he turned around and saw the architect walking through the site entrance. He had exactly enough time to identify her, and not enough time to do anything sensible about it. Vanessa Caldwell walked onto the site, wearing her hard hat over the twist-out she had been wearing since their first date, clipboard in one hand, phone in the other, already talking to the site supervisor about a discrepancy in the load-bearing calculations on the northeast wall. She was 40 feet away. She had not looked in his direction. Marcus turned back to what he was doing with a speed that Devon probably registered as odd and said nothing about. His heart was doing something it had not done since he was 17 years old, and tried to bluff his way through a card game he had not understood. For a full minute, he simply stood with his back turned and breathed, which was all he could think to do. Then he thought it through. He had a beard he had not trimmed in 3 weeks. He had skin that had darkened from days of outdoor work. He had the posture and the clothes and the context of a construction laborer. Vanessa was 40 feet away and had just walked onto a busy job site with 17 other men in hard hats, none of whom she was looking at individually. He was, in the parlance of the experiment he had designed, exactly as invisible as he had intended to be. She was not going to recognize him. Not from this distance, not in this context, not with everything else she was focused on. He was right. She didn't look at him twice. And that, the fact that she didn't recognize him, the fact that he was so thoroughly unremarkable in this context, that the woman who knew the shape of his sleeping face did not clock him as present, carried its own particular kind of sting. But then he started watching her work, and what he saw over the next several days rearranged something in him that he had not known needed rearranging. Vanessa Caldwell on a job site was not the Vanessa he saw at dinner, or at events, or in the comfortable privacy of their life together. She was something sharper and, if it was possible, something more genuinely herself. She moved through the space with a quiet authority that did not need to announce itself. When she corrected something, she corrected it clearly and without condescension. When she asked a question, she listened to the answer with the full attention of someone who actually wanted the information. She learned the names of every man on the crew within 2 days and used them consistently. Not in the performative way of someone who has been coached to build rapport, but in the natural way of someone who simply does not see a reason to address people as though they are interchangeable. Marcus watched her from a safe distance and recognized something that no intelligence he had applied to this experiment had prepared him for. He was watching someone whose character was not a performance. It was simply who she was, all the way down, at every altitude of circumstance. There was a 20-year-old kid on the crew named Terrell, who had left a community college program 6 months earlier when his mother got sick and the family needed income. Terrell was good with his hands, but anxious in the specific way of young men who know they are capable, but have not yet been given enough confirmation of that by the world. Vanessa noticed him on her second day on site, not in a dramatic way. She did not pull him aside for a mentoring conversation or make a production of including him. She simply started directing small technical questions toward him during site walkthroughs, questions that required him to think and respond rather than just listen. Marcus watched Terrell's posture change over 3 days as those interactions accumulated. He watched a young man who had been holding himself slightly collapsed, shoulders curved in, eyes mostly down, begin to stand up. It cost Vanessa almost nothing. She did it because she noticed a person and responded to what she noticed. Marcus understood, watching it happen, that this was the kind of behavior you cannot manufacture for an audience. You either do this or you don't. There is no middle version. It was a Thursday morning, 19 days into the disguise, and Marcus had almost ended the experiment the night before. He had sat in the one-bedroom apartment with a beer he didn't touch and his phone in his hand, looking at the contact entry for Calvin Brooks, genuinely prepared to call and say it was over. He had what he came for. He had watched Vanessa for 2 weeks, in a context where she had no reason to perform anything for anyone, and what he had seen had not left him with evidence of calculation or performance. It had left him with evidence of a woman who treated construction workers with the same engaged respect she brought to conversations with senior partners, who remembered the names of men she had met only once, who pushed back against decisions that compromised safety even when it complicated her professional relationships. He had come looking for doubt, and he had found its opposite. He should have called Calvin. He should have ended it right there. He did not call. He did not end it. He told himself he needed 1 more week, and he went to sleep. And in the morning, he went back to the site. The collapse happened at 10:47 in the morning. The building, a brownstone that had been constructed in 1924, had, as old buildings sometimes do, a secret in its bones that no pre-renovation assessment had caught. A section of the original interior framing, masked by decades of retrofitting and plaster overlay, had been deteriorating for years in a way that the building's exterior gave no indication of. When the renovation crew began work on repositioning a section of the northeast interior wall, standard procedure, well within the parameters of the structural plan, the original framing gave way. It was not a catastrophic collapse. Nobody would later describe it as anything close to the worst construction accident any of them had seen. But a primary support beam shifted, dropped, and came to rest on the one person in the room who had not had the fraction of a second necessary to move. The beam caught Marcus across the right shoulder and forearm. The impact drove him to the ground. The pain was immediate and total. White behind the eyes, the kind that temporarily removes your ability to think about anything else. And then the shouting started, and the sound of other men moving, and then something entirely unexpected. Her voice, cutting through all of it, clear and close and steady in a way that made no sense given the distance she had been standing from him just seconds before. She had been 40 feet away reviewing the updated structural drawings when the beam came down. She had crossed that distance in the time it took the dust to begin settling, which means she was moving before the noise had finished, before the situation had fully resolved itself into something her mind could categorize and respond to. She had her hand on his shoulder before the site foreman had located his radio. She told the men around her not to move him yet, not until they had confirmed nothing else was pinned or structurally compromised. She told someone to call for an ambulance. She looked directly at Marcus, and she told him to look at her, to stay with her, to keep his eyes open. And there was something in the way she said those words, not frantic, not performative, just absolutely and completely focused on him, as if nothing else in the radius of that moment existed, that Marcus would later describe as the most disorienting experience of his adult life. He was looking up at the face of the woman he had been secretly observing for 19 days, and she was looking back at him without the faintest idea who she was looking at. She was keeping a stranger alive. She was doing it with her entire self. She was doing it because it was what the moment required, and she was the kind of person who responded to what moments required. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes after the collapse. Vanessa rode with him. She had not been asked to, and the paramedics had not objected because she had been useful in the first moments after arrival, giving them a clear account of exactly what had happened, when it had happened, what Marcus had and had not been able to communicate since, and because she had stated with calm authority that she was not leaving. She held his left hand in both of hers during the ride and talked to him steadily about things that did not matter. The project timeline, the weather that week, a restaurant she had been meaning to try, because she understood instinctively that what he needed was not information, but the sound of another human being staying with him, proof that he was not alone in this. At the hospital, when they wheeled him back for x-rays and assessment, she was directed to the waiting area. She went. She sat down in one of the plastic chairs that hospitals provide, the kind that communicate, through their design, that comfort is not the priority, and she stayed there. 2 hours, through the end of her workday, past any professional obligation she could have pointed to as justification for remaining. A nurse asked her at one point whether she was family. Vanessa said no. The nurse asked whether she knew the patient well. Vanessa said she had known him for about 3 weeks. The nurse had the look of someone doing a calculation that did not add up. Vanessa told her, quietly and without apology, that nobody should be alone in a hospital after something like that, whether you had known them for 3 weeks or 30 years. She said it the way she said most things that she believed completely, without raising her voice, without needing anyone in the room to agree with her. The nurse nodded and went back to work. Vanessa sat back down and waited. And Marcus, in the room where the doctors were assessing the damage, a fractured forearm, deep bruising along the shoulder, nothing requiring surgery, nothing that would not heal, was lying on the examination table, with his eyes on the ceiling, and he was not thinking about his arm. He was thinking about a woman who had run 40 feet through construction chaos to reach a stranger. He was thinking about 2 hours in a hospital waiting room for someone she barely knew. And he was thinking, with a clarity he had not felt in 2 months, about exactly how much he had gotten wrong. The doctors discharged him late that afternoon, with his forearm in a split and instructions to follow up with an orthopedic specialist within 48 hours. Vanessa was still in the waiting room when they brought him out. She stood up immediately and looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has been holding a controlled amount of tension for several hours and is now cautiously releasing it. Not relief exactly, but the beginning of relief. The first breath after a long hold. She asked him how he was. He told her he had a fractured forearm and a lot of bruising and that he would be fine. She said she was glad. She gave him her phone number and told him to contact her if he needed anything. And then she said something that Marcus has thought about every day since. She said that construction sites were her responsibility. Every person who came through the gate was under her oversight in some professional sense. But that even if that had not been true, she would have stayed. She said she would have stayed anyway. And then she said goodnight and she went home. And Marcus stood in the hospital parking lot and felt, for the first time in a very long time, completely and utterly ashamed of himself. He did not go back to the rental apartment that night. He drove, instead, to a parking structure 2 blocks from his actual penthouse and sat in the car for an hour. He was not ready to go inside yet. He was not ready to be in the space where Marcus Ellison lived, because Marcus Ellison had been doing something that he could not dress up as rational, no matter how he arranged the words. He had designed a month-long covert operation to measure the character of a woman who had given him 18 months of consistent, honest, generous behavior. Because his mother had voiced a concern, and because a wound from his childhood had found a crack to work through. He had left Vanessa alone, had told her he was gone for legitimate professional reasons, while he watched her from 40 feet away, like someone who had decided that a relationship was a puzzle to be solved, rather than a person to be trusted. And Vanessa, who had not known any of this was happening, had spent the day on her knees in Rubble and 2 hours in a hospital waiting room for a man she thought was a stranger. The contrast between what she had done, freely and without knowing she was being observed, and what he had done, deliberately and in secret, was not something he could minimize or rationalize his way around. He sat in that parking structure and he let it be what it was. It was wrong. He had done something wrong, and now he had to figure out how to make it right. The email arrived at 9:14 on a Tuesday morning, 4 days after the accident. Vanessa had been checking on Marcus, the man she knew as Marcus Reed, the construction worker who had been hurt on her site, by text every day since the accident. He had responded with brief, careful messages that told her he was recovering and that he was grateful. She had no reason to read anything into the brevity. She had no reason to suspect that the careful quality of his responses was the careful quality of a man who knew the whole architecture of this situation and was trying to figure out how to confess it without making things worse. She was simply being the person she was, the person who checked on people because that was what she did. And she had a full workday ahead of her and 4 projects in various stages of completion, and a presentation scheduled for the following Thursday that she had not had occasion to think about in the past few days. And then the email came. It was from the managing partner at Mitchell Hartley Associates, a man named Douglas Hartley who had been running the firm for 23 years and who had the particular quality of very senior partners, a kind of affable authority that felt encouraging right up until the moment it did not. The email congratulated Priscilla Morton on securing the client approval for the Lindenmeyer Waterfront Cultural Center concept. It described the client's response to the initial presentation as enthusiastic. It noted that Priscilla had shown significant creative maturity in the development of the concept, and that the firm was looking forward to seeing the project move into the next phase under her lead. Vanessa read this email 3 times. She was sitting at her desk in the open plan section of the office, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday morning. Keyboards, a phone conversation at the far end of the room, the coffee machine cycling through its routine. And she read the email 3 times because the words did not assemble into anything that made sense on the first read. Or the second. The Lindenmeyer concept was her work. Every single element of it. The sight lines and the gathering spaces and the material choices and the structural approach and the historical references woven through the design. All of it was hers. She had developed it over 4 months. She had drawn the earliest sketches on graph paper at her kitchen table on a Saturday in June, working from her grandmother's stories, and she still had that graph paper in a folder in her desk drawer. She sat very still for 3 minutes. Later, she would not be able to account precisely for what happened in those 3 minutes, what thoughts passed through in what order. But what she would remember is the stillness itself. Her grandmother Ruth had taught her something that she had applied more times than she could count in her professional life and her personal one. She had taught her that the first response to injustice, if you intend to actually address it, is not reaction. The first response is stillness. You get quiet before you get loud, because loud without strategy is just noise, and noise does not move things. Quiet with strategy moves things. Vanessa sat still for 3 minutes, and then she opened her laptop and she went to the file backup system she had maintained since her 2nd year in the industry, a habit born not from suspicion of any particular colleague, but from a general professional philosophy that your work is your work and you are responsible for being able to prove it. She had every draft of the Lindenmayer concept, time-stamped, going back 4 months. She had every email exchange related to the project. She had the graph paper sketches, now scanned and saved. She had everything she needed. She took a breath, and she began to build her case. Marcus was lying on the couch in his rental apartment with his fractured arm elevated and his laptop balanced on his chest when his COO, a woman named Patricia Sims, sent him a courtesy email copying him on the upcoming Lindenmayer Waterfront Cultural Center presentation. It was a formality. Patricia had been managing the firm's active investment portfolio competently in Marcus's absence and had no particular need for his input on a presentation that was already scheduled and prepared. She was simply keeping him informed in the way that good COOs do. The email listed the presenting architect as Priscilla Morton. Marcus sat up so fast that his arm registered a protest he had to breathe through. He had heard that name. Vanessa had mentioned Priscilla Morton 4 months ago, maybe 5, had mentioned her with the particular careful warmth of a mentor who genuinely liked her mentee and was genuinely invested in her development. He opened the attached presentation file with his good hand, the concept drawings loaded on his screen, and Marcus Ellison, who was not an architect and had never studied architecture, looked at those drawings and knew exactly whose hand had made them. He knew, because he had watched Vanessa work at her desk in the evenings, enough times to have a physical memory of the way her hand moved across paper. He knew, because he had seen her tilt her head at a specific angle when something in a design resolved correctly, and that angle was somehow present in the choices embedded in these drawings. He knew because the waterfront concept referenced a kind of historical reverence that could only come from someone who had a personal connection to the history being honored. And Priscilla Morton had no such connection, while Vanessa Caldwell had told him, months ago over dinner, about her grandmother's stories of the water and the people who had worked it. He sat with this for 90 seconds. Then he picked up his phone and called Patricia. He told her to pull the Lindenmayer presentation. He told her not to allow it to proceed until he had personally reviewed the provenance of the design work. Patricia, who was professional and discreet and had worked with Marcus long enough to know that he did not make these calls without reason, said yes and asked no further questions. Then Marcus put the phone down and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then he called Calvin Brooks. He told Calvin that the experiment was over. He told Calvin to get a message to Vanessa, to the Vanessa she knew as his associate, to Marcus Reed's emergency contact, telling her that Marcus Reed was recovering and needed to speak with her urgently about the Lindenmayer project. He gave Calvin an address to pass along. Not the rental address, the Penthouse. He sat for a long time after he hung up, his broken arm aching in its brace, the late afternoon light coming through the apartment window at an angle that made the room look like something temporary, which it was, which it had always been, which it always was going to be. He thought about what he was about to do. He thought about Vanessa's face in the rubble. He thought about 2 hours in a hospital waiting room. He thought about what it was going to look like when she walked through that door and understood everything at once. He did not let himself minimize what was coming. He sat with it. He tried to be as honest, in that quiet room, about what he owed her, as he had been dishonest about his reasons for starting the experiment in the first place. And then he waited. Vanessa arrived at the address Calvin had given her on a Thursday evening, 3 days after the email from Douglas Hartley, and 3 days after she had quietly begun assembling the documentation she would need. She had spent those 3 days in a state of controlled focus, still going to work, still meeting with clients, still doing everything her professional life required, while simultaneously building, in the evenings, a meticulous record of everything that was hers. She had said nothing to anyone at the firm. She was not ready to be loud yet. She was still in the quiet phase. She arrived at the address expecting something she could not quite define. Perhaps a meeting with a contractor representative. Perhaps something related to the accident site. Perhaps an insurance matter connected to Marcus Reed's injury. She had not been told what to expect. She had been told only that it was urgent and that it involved the Lindenmeyer project, and those two facts in conjunction had been enough to bring her here. The confrontation with Priscilla Morton happened the following Monday. Marcus had made one phone call from his penthouse the evening Vanessa arrived. Not to explain himself, not to arrange anything related to their personal situation, but to exercise his authority as Ellison Capital's primary investor in the Lindenmeyer project, to postpone the presentation, pending a review of the design provenance. Douglas Hartley had received this call with the careful professional composure of a man who understood that when the lead investor calls to pause a presentation, you pause the presentation and you ask your questions later. The meeting was rescheduled. The format was restructured. Instead of a presentation by the project architect, it would be a provenance review, a documentation walkthrough of the design process from inception through the current state of the work. Priscilla Morton was informed of the change. She had been informed that the firm's lead investor would be present. She had not been told who the lead investor was or what he knew. Priscilla Morton walked into that conference room on Monday morning, expecting to manage a complication. She was composed. She had prepared responses to questions about the design, responses that were technically plausible, built on the familiarity with the work that 2 years of watching Vanessa develop it had given her. She was a talented enough young woman that her familiarity with the work was not entirely superficial, and she had convinced herself, in the days leading up to the meeting, that there were degrees of collaborative knowledge that could be characterized differently depending on who was asking and how. She understood there was risk. She had assessed the risk as manageable. She walked into the room and her composure held until she saw who was sitting at the head of the table. She had seen photographs of Marcus Ellison. Most people in the Charlotte business community had seen photographs of Marcus Ellison. She recognized him immediately, and the recognition changed the mathematics of her risk assessment in real time, and her composure wobbled in a way that everyone in the room noticed and nobody mentioned. Vanessa was seated at Marcus's right. In front of her was a folder. The folder was not thick in a threatening way. It was not a legal brief or a stack of accusations. It was simply an organized record of everything she had created, in the order she had created it, with the dates and the times and the file metadata intact. She had not come to this meeting to be dramatic. She had not come to perform a vindication. She had come because her work was her work, because her grandmother's waterfront stories were embedded in every choice she had made in that design, and because the simple truth, supported by the simple evidence of when the files had been created and by whom, was enough to establish everything that needed to be established, without raising her voice or making a single accusation she could not prove. Marcus said he would like Vanessa to walk the room through the complete design history of the Lindenmeyer concept before any presentation was made. He said it in the tone of a man who is asking a question he already knows the answer to, which is a very specific tone, and everyone in the room understood it. Vanessa walked the room through 4 months of documented work in 22 minutes. She was methodical. She was complete. She did not editorialize. She did not look at Priscilla Morton during most of it, because she did not need to. The documentation spoke without her needing to direct anyone's attention. Priscilla's composure deteriorated across those 22 minutes with the gradual, unavoidable quality of a material that has been placed under more load than its design can support. By the time Vanessa reached the final section of the documentation, the early sketches, the graph paper from June, the handwritten notes referencing her grandmother Ruth's stories about the waterfront, there was nothing Priscilla could say that would have changed what everyone in that room already understood. The partners were not people who needed things explained to them slowly. They could read a timestamp. They could read a file history. They could read a woman's face when she understands that the ground has given way beneath her. Douglas Hartley asked Priscilla a single question when Vanessa finished. He asked her if she had anything to add to the design history that had been presented. Priscilla said no. Hartley thanked her and asked her to wait in another room. The rest of the meeting lasted 11 minutes. Priscilla Morton was escorted from the building by HR before noon. Douglas Hartley called Vanessa into his office at 2 o'clock that afternoon. He was direct in the way that men of his generation are when they know they are in the wrong, and have decided that directness is the only remaining form of dignity available to them. He said the firm owed her an apology, and he delivered it without qualifications attached. He said the firm had failed to create an environment in which her work was adequately protected, and her contributions were accurately attributed, and that this failure was institutional, not incidental, and that he was personally responsible for having not caught it sooner. He offered her the Lindenmeyer project in full, as lead architect with complete creative control and sole public credit. He offered her a promotion to senior partner, not contingent on the Lindenmeyer project's outcome, but effective immediately. reflecting what her work over the previous 3 years had already merited. And he offered the formal written apology that she would need to have on record if she chose to escalate the matter externally. He said he hoped she would not feel it necessary to escalate externally, but that he understood if she did, and that the firm would not contest what was documented. Vanessa accepted the project, the promotion, and the written apology. She did not escalate externally, and she did not say this to reassure Douglas Hartley or to avoid conflict. She said it because her goal had never been to damage the firm. It had been to recover what was hers and to make sure the record reflected the truth. Both of those things had now happened. Her grandmother Ruth had not been a woman who fought beyond the point of necessity. She had been a woman who fought precisely to the point at which the thing she was fighting for had been secured. And then she stopped. She stopped because she had other things to do. Vanessa had other things to do. She thanked Hartley with the composed professionalism that had characterized every interaction she had ever had in that office. She picked up her folder, and she went back to her desk and opened her drawing software, and spent the rest of the afternoon doing the work she had been doing all along. She went to the Penthouse that evening. Marcus had not asked her to come. He had sent one message that morning saying he had pulled the presentation and that whatever happened next was her call, completely. She had read that message twice, and then put her phone in her bag, and gone into the conference room and done what she needed to do. When she arrived at the Penthouse that evening, Marcus was in the kitchen making tea, not because it was something he particularly wanted, but because it gave his good hand something to do. He had spent the day in a state of careful quiet, waiting and not calling, honoring the boundaries she had set the night before when she told him she needed to handle the professional situation herself before she could think clearly about anything else. She came in, put her bag down, and sat at the kitchen table. He brought 2 cups over and sat across from her. Neither of them touched the tea for a long time. What they said to each other in that kitchen over the next hour is the kind of conversation that does not compress well into a clean narrative, because it was not clean. It was honest, which means it had the roughness that honesty carries when the subject is something that actually matters. Vanessa said again what she had said the night before, that she was not angry he had doubt, that she understood where the doubt came from, that she was angry he had not brought it to her. She said she was the kind of person you could ask hard questions, and that if he had asked her directly whether she was with him for his money or for him, she would have answered him directly, and the answer would have been the same answer he had found by other means. She said that what the month had cost her was not a dramatic thing. She had not been harmed in any visible way, and she knew that, but that it had cost her a specific thing she had not anticipated. It had cost her the experience of being trusted by the person who was supposed to trust her most. She said that was not a small cost. She said he needed to understand that was not a small cost. Marcus said he understood. He said it without adding anything to it, because he had decided that this conversation did not need his additions. What it needed was for him to listen and to absorb, and to let what she was saying be exactly what it was. He had spent 2 months building a private case against her. He had spent 30 days watching her from a distance instead of standing in front of her and saying the thing that needed to be said. He had an enormously capable mind, and he had used it, during those months, in precisely the wrong direction. He could have talked. He could have been honest about the doubt and asked her to help him through it. That was what she would have done. That was what the month had shown him she was capable of. Not just in the Rubble, not just in the hospital, but in 100 smaller moments across 19 days of watching. He had known how to reach her. He had chosen, instead, to design a test. And sitting across from her now, with his fractured arm and his untouched tea, he understood that choice as what it had been. Not strategy, not rationality, but fear. He had been afraid of the conversation. He had been afraid that if he asked the question and she gave him the wrong answer, he would have to do something about it. And so he had built an elaborate detour around his own courage. The silence that came after was different from the silence of the night before. The previous night's silence had been the silence of 2 people who had not yet said everything that needed to be said. This silence was the silence of 2 people who had said it, and were now sitting with the aftermath, deciding what they were willing to do with it. Marcus broke the silence. He said something that he had been holding since the hospital parking structure. Not a justification, not a request for forgiveness, but a question. He asked her whether she thought trust was something that could be rebuilt from a point of damage, or whether the damage was the thing that defined the structure from that point forward. He asked it the way engineers ask questions about materials, genuinely, wanting the answer, not wanting to be told what he hoped to hear. Vanessa looked at him across the table. She picked up her tea. She said that trust was not a single object that broke and was either replaced or wasn't. She said trust was built the way good buildings were built, continuously, adaptively, accounting for what you had learned and what the site had taught you along the way. She said that what had happened had changed what she knew about the site, but she had not said it had made the project impossible. Marcus reached across the table with his good hand and found hers. She did not move away. They sat like that for a while, neither of them talking, both of them understanding that the next thing, whatever they were building next, was going to require a different quality of honesty from both of them than anything they had managed in the previous 18 months. Not because what they had before had been dishonest, but because it had been incomplete. He had kept a wound hidden. She had not known to ask about it. Going forward would require the kind of openness that is harder than secrecy and more demanding than performance, but the only kind that actually produces something that can hold weight over time. It would require him to say the frightening thing instead of engineering around it. It would require her to be willing to hear things that were uncomfortable without treating them as evidence of fundamental unsoundness. It would require both of them to operate on the assumption that the other person was doing their best in good faith, which, as the previous month had conclusively demonstrated in the most complicated possible way, they had both been doing all along. There is a version of this story that is easy to tell. In that version, a rich man doubts the woman he loves, goes undercover to test her, and discovers that she is everything he hoped she was. She passes the test. He proposes. Everything resolves into warmth and certainty. That version is satisfying because it is tidy. But it is not an honest account of what actually happened here, and it misses the thing that makes this story worth telling. The most important moment in this entire sequence is not the accident, and it is not the hospital, and it is not the conference room. The most important moment is the one Marcus himself identified, when he sat in that parking structure on the night of the accident, looking at his life with his arm in a brace and his chest full of something he could not name at first, and then recognized, slowly, as the specific weight of having done something you cannot undo. The most important moment is the one in which he understood that the test was not evidence of his intelligence, or his caution, or his self-protective rationality. It was evidence of his fear, and fear dressed up as strategy is still fear. Vanessa Caldwell never needed a test. The 30 days that Marcus spent watching her were 30 days of confirming something he could have learned, could have known with equal certainty, from a single honest conversation. She had been the same person every day of those 19 days on the construction site. Whether she was directing a structural correction or bringing coffee on a cold morning, or pushing back against a partner over the phone, or kneeling in the dust beside a man she did not know. Character of that consistency does not emerge from performance. It emerges from who a person has been trained, over decades, by the people they loved and the choices they made, to simply be. Ruth Caldwell had given Vanessa that training at a kitchen table in Birmingham. Denise Ellison had given Marcus something similar. The conviction that what you build with your own hands is more honest than what you inherit. And somewhere along the way, the weight of what Marcus had built had separated him from the directness his mother had always modeled. He had learned to construct elaborate protections. He had forgotten how to simply ask. The research on this question, on why people test the partners they claim to trust rather than talking to them, is both extensive and dispiriting. Psychologists who study relationship behavior consistently find that loyalty tests, regardless of their outcome, tend to damage the relationship they are intended to protect. The person being tested, if they discover the test has occurred, experiences a fundamental violation of the premise of the relationship, the premise that they are being engaged with directly, as a full adult capable of honest exchange, rather than managed from a distance. The trust deficit created by the discovery of a test is frequently larger than the trust deficit the test was designed to address. Marcus Ellison got lucky, if that is the right word for it, in a way that most people who run these experiments do not. He got lucky because the accident forced a confrontation that he was planning, but had not yet managed, and it forced it in a context where everything had already been made plain, where Vanessa's character was already visible, and already proven in a way that preceded, rather than followed, the disclosure. He did not have to tell her what he had done and then hope she believed him that she had passed. She already knew she had passed, because she had been herself the whole time, and herself was more than enough. What Priscilla Morton did was a separate matter, but not an entirely separate story. What she did was identify something valuable and try to take it by a method that depended on the assumption that the person it belonged to was not paying close enough attention to defend it. She was wrong about Vanessa, in the same way Marcus was wrong about Vanessa. She had underestimated how prepared and how methodical and how fundamentally secure in her own work Vanessa Caldwell actually was. Vanessa had been maintaining her backup files not because she was paranoid or defensive, but because she was professional, in the specific way of someone who understands that your work is your responsibility, and you do not outsource that responsibility to the goodwill of the environment around you. Ruth Caldwell had taught her that too. Get quiet. Have your documentation. Know what is yours, and be able to show it. The world will test this knowledge. When it does, you want to already have the answer. Vanessa and Marcus rebuilt what they had. It took longer than either of them would have chosen, and it required a different quality of conversation than they had been having before. The kind where you say the thing that is frightening to say, rather than the thing that is comfortable to say, where you ask the hard question instead of building a workaround for it. Marcus saw a therapist for the first time in his adult life, not because Vanessa asked him to, but because he understood, from what had happened, that he was carrying weight that predated their relationship, and that carrying it alone was not working. He went every week for 14 months. He talked about his father and about what it felt like to be 8 years old and to watch a car pull out of a driveway. He talked about the specific texture of the doubt that had grown from his mother's words, and how quickly something planted in the right kind of fear can take over everything around it. It was not easy work. It was not the kind of work that produced dramatic revelations. It was slow, patient, structural work. The kind Vanessa did every day, in a different domain, with a different set of tools. They got married 15 months after the accident. The ceremony was small and real, which was what they both wanted. Denise Ellison was in the front row, and she cried in the particular way of a woman who has been waiting a long time for something she was not sure she was going to get to see. Ruth Caldwell could not be there. She had passed away 3 years before Vanessa met Marcus. But Vanessa carried her into the room in the way you carry people who shaped you, not as a performance of grief or as a gesture for an audience, but as the plain fact of who you are and how you got there. The Lindenmeyer Waterfront Cultural Center broke ground the following spring. Vanessa's name was the first name on every document. The building is designed to be seen from the water, which means that the sight lines account for the angle of the evening light and the position of the boats and the quality of the air above the waterfront at dusk. It is the most personal thing she has ever built professionally. She designed it for the people who will use it, and she designed it for a woman who sat on the banks of a waterfront 60 years ago and believed, with the patient certainty of someone who has earned the right to believe, that the world could eventually look like something better than what it had been. There is something worth sitting with in all of this. We tell ourselves that testing someone is a form of care, that it is the responsible thing, the cautious thing, the thing a person does when they have been hurt before and cannot afford to be hurt again. And there is a version of that story that is true. Caution is reasonable, self-protection is human, but there is a point at which caution becomes construction, where we build elaborate structures around the simple, terrifying act of saying what we need and asking for what we want to know. Marcus Ellison built an extremely elaborate structure. It cost him 30 days, a fractured arm, and nearly everything that mattered to him. What he could have had instead, what was available to him the entire time, waiting patiently on the other side of a single honest question, was a conversation. Vanessa would have answered him. She would have looked at him and told him the truth, clearly and without theatrics, the way she did everything. He did not need 30 days. He needed 4 minutes and the courage to begin. Character is what survives the moments nobody is grading. If you find someone whose character does not change based on the audience in the room, hold on to them. Not because they passed a test, because they never needed one to begin with. This story happened because one woman's character was steady enough to hold its shape under pressure, in Rubble, in a hospital waiting room, and in a conference room, where she had every right to be angry and chose instead to be precise. It happened because one man was brave enough, eventually, to stop running from the question and face it directly. And it happened because the truth, about who Vanessa was, about what had happened to her work, about what Marcus owed her, was not something that could be hidden indefinitely. Truth in this story was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. It was simply the accumulated record of what two people had actually done and been, over time, when no one with stakes in the answer was watching. That record was more reliable than any test. It always is. We want to hear from you. Have you ever known someone whose character did not change based on who was watching them? Someone who treated the person serving their coffee the same way they treated the person running the meeting? Someone whose consistency made you feel, in a way you could not fully articulate, that you were in the presence of something rare? Tell us about that person in the comments. We read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, if something in it felt true in a way that matters to you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. The next story we're bringing you involves a decision made in 3 seconds that took 14 years to fully understand. Subscribe so you're here when it comes. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.